Today, we're jumping right into probably the most critical diplomatic flashpoint recently. We're talking about the Israel-Gaza conflict, specifically those intense real-time negotiations. We're going to focus on a really pivotal 72-hour window back in early October 2025. So if you're trying to get your head around what actually happened in that flurry of talks, what was offered, what was demanded back, and frankly, why it all seemed so precarious, then you're definitely in the right place. We're digging into the sources, looking at the events around October 3rd and 4th, 2025.
That's exactly right. We're aiming to go beyond just the headlines here. Our goal today is really to unpack the specific terms Hamas put out there publicly and then look at the immediate reactions from the U.S., from Israel, which were, quite contradictory in some ways. And crucially, we have to look at the reality on the ground, the violence that was still happening even as these talks were supposedly progressing or at least being set up. We really need to grasp the core differences between what was actually offered and what got rejected and why.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this sequence. It all kicks off with that Hamas announcement on October 3rd, 2025. And this wasn't some leak, right? This was a public declaration. So what were the main pieces of what they put on the table?
Well, the headline piece, the really significant part, was the trade itself. Hamas announced they were ready to release all the remaining Israeli hostages, and that's a comprehensive offer concerning the captives. It understandably generated a lot of hope globally, almost instantly. But, and this is the crucial linkage, that offer was tied, absolutely tied, to one single condition from their side. A permanent ceasefire, that was it. They were essentially saying, we'll give you this immediate humanitarian resolution, get everyone home, but in return, the fighting stops for good, no resumption. So that framework, hostages for a permanent ceasefire, that was the core proposal right there.
Okay, hostages for a permanent ceasefire. But here's where it got, I think, even more complex, moving beyond just a prisoner swap. Hamas specifically tied their offer to another document, right? A broader political framework. They mentioned agreeing to parts of U.S. President Donald Trump's 20-point peace proposal, humanitarian parts, administrative parts. Why? Why bring that specific plan into it? What's the significance there?
Yeah, that's a really key detail. It signals a shift, maybe, towards talking about the longer-term structure, which, frankly, is quite unusual in these very immediate high-stakes hostage talks. President Trump's 20-point plan. Look, it was controversial, never fully got off the ground, but it was out there. An internationally known blueprint, sort of, for what post-conflict Gaza might look like, governance, security, all that. So by nodding towards parts of it, Hamas was, really for the first time in this context, signaling they might be willing to engage with international ideas about Gaza's future, beyond just the immediate fighting. And we need to look really closely at the two specific elements from that 20-point plan they reportedly agreed to, because they tell us a lot about what kind of future structure they might accept.
Okay, lay those out for us. What were those 2 points they agreed to? What does it tell us about their thinking on post-conflict Gaza?
Okay, first, they agreed to future talks on prisoner exchanges. This suggests that the initial big hostage release wouldn't be the end of it. It sort of sets the stage for a longer political process about other Palestinians held by Israel. A continued dialogue. Second, and this is what you call the geopolitical nugget, and I think that's right, they agreed to the idea of Gaza being administered by a Palestinian technocratic body. Now that is a really powerful signal, because it goes straight to the heart of the question, who runs Gaza after the fighting stops?
Let's just pause on that term for a second. Palestinian technocratic body. It sounds very diplomatic, maybe a bit academic. But what does technocratic actually mean here? And why would that be such a significant thing for Hamas to agree to, even notionally?
Right. It's basically the opposite of saying Hamas rule or Fatah rule or any specific faction. Technocratic implies non-political experts running things. Think engineers, economists, public health folks. People focused on rebuilding, on services, on just making things work day to day, not driven by a military agenda or a specific political ideology. Historically, that's the idea. Professionals running the civil side of things.
Right.
And for Hamas, which is, fundamentally both a political and a militant group, agreeing to that kind of administration, well, it suggests they might be willing to step back from civil governance. Maybe. Or at least concede that role. It's a potentially huge political signal sort of embedded within this hostage offer.
Yeah.
You're saying we might discuss administrative structure if we get that permanent ceasefire.
Okay, so a layered offer then. All hostages back, yes, but tied to a permanent end to the war. And with this political element added in agreeing to a specific time of future governance for Gaza, drawn from a U.S. plan.
Exactly. It was an attempt, it seems, to tackle both the immediate human crisis, the hostages, and that fundamental long-term question of who governs Gaza.
Okay, so that's the offer on the table. Now, the reactions, the international response. How did the big players react? Let's start with President Trump in the U.S.
President Trump reacted very quickly,
Yeah.
publicly. And his focus was entirely on the hostages, on trying to get them out safely, using this offer as leverage. He publicly called on Israel to halt the bombing in Gaza immediately. But notice the framing. It's important. The stated reason wasn't to accept the permanent ceasefire. It was specifically to create a safe window for hostage extraction. So the U.S. was kind of grabbing the humanitarian part of the offer. Let's get the people out. But sidestepping, very deliberately, Hamas's core political demand for a permanent end to the war. It was a very focused diplomatic move trying to separate the hostage release from the ceasefire condition.
Right. That makes sense. Seize the opening for the hostages, but keep options open on the bigger picture. Shrewd. But then you have the Israeli response, which was, well, starkly different. Israeli officials basically called the Hamas offer a rejection. Now, how does an offer to release all hostages get framed as a rejection? That seems like the core contradiction we need to understand here.
It really boils down to differing priorities. And the Israeli perspective, at least based on the sources we have, drew a very sharp line between, say, a temporary political setup and what they see as fundamental long-term security needs. So yes, getting the hostages back was obviously hugely important, but the proposal itself was seen as fundamentally flawed. Insufficient. Why? Because of what it didn't include. Key things Israel views as absolute requirements for its own safety down the line.
Okay, so what was missing? What were the deal breakers from the Israeli perspective?
The core omissions, according to reports, were commitments regarding disarmament and control. That was the sticking point. Israel's primary focus, it seems, is making sure that whoever runs Gaza in the future simply cannot pose a military threat again. A technocratic body might fix the roads and the power grid, sure, but does it dismantle tunnels? Does it stop rocket manufacturing? Does it prevent rearmament? That's the Israeli concern. So from their viewpoint, accepting a permanent ceasefire just for a technocratic administration without guarantees on disarmament and military control, well, that basically risks ending up right back where they started before October 7th eventually. Their position implies that the security goal, eliminating the military threat permanently, has to come before, or at least alongside, the hostage release. It takes precedence.
Wow, okay. That really clarifies the fundamental tension, doesn't it? You've got Hamas putting political concessions on the table, the technocratic body idea, plus this huge humanitarian gesture, all the hostages, in exchange for the war ending permanently. And then Israel saying, hold on, the immediate security threat, the military capability, has to be dealt with first. Disarmament and control are paramount, even over the immediate return of the hostages.
Precisely. It highlights the clash between a potential political negotiation pathway and a hardline strategic security doctrine. Hamas is offering politics. Israel is demanding military outcomes. And because the Hamas offer didn't meet that specific security threshold disarmament, control, it was dismissed, labeled a rejection of Israel's core demands for long-term safety.
And all of this intense diplomacy, the offer, Trump's call for a pause, Israel's rejection, it wasn't happening in some quiet negotiation room. It was happening while the fighting was still going on. That's the really sobering backdrop here. What was the situation on the ground, say, on October 4th, the day after the Hamas announcement?
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty grim picture of that disconnect. Despite all the high-level talk and this public offer potentially saving lives, the military reality didn't change. Israeli airstrikes reportedly continued right through October 4th. The diplomacy was happening, quite literally, over an active war zone.
And we have to acknowledge the human cost of that continued fighting, even while ceasefire terms were being debated.
Absolutely. The continuation of those strikes into October 4th reportedly killed at least 66 Palestinians. That specific tragic detail really hammers home the urgency, and the terrible stakes involved in this diplomatic deadlock. Every hour that passed without agreement, the human toll just kept rising. It shows the gap between those security demands and ceasefire demands isn't abstract.
So, given that Israel rejected the specific terms offered on October 3rd and the fighting was ongoing, you might think, okay, talks are dead. But apparently not. What happened next? What was the immediate plan?
Right, the rejection of that specific package didn't actually kill the process entirely. It seems it just shifted it. Even with the public disagreement, the diplomatic channels stayed open. The key players pretty much immediately started setting up the next attempt. Indirect talks were scheduled to begin just a day later, on October 5th, essentially trying to pick up the pieces almost immediately, just 48 hours after that public offer was made and rejected.
That takes a lot of effort behind the scenes just to get people lined up for talks again, especially indirect ones. Who are the key mediators making this happen? Who's driving these next step talks?
It's really that core group of three players who have connections and some leverage with the different sides. You've got Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S. Egypt's vital because of the border, its history mediating between Israel and Palestinian factions. Qatar is crucial for its communication links, especially with Hamas and its financial influence. In the U.S., well, it brings the superpower weight, the connection to Israel, and also President Trump's 20-point plan is still kind of the reference point, however flawed, for some of these post-conflict ideas. It's really their combined diplomatic muscle keeping the possibility of talks alive, even after that public rejection.
Okay, so this 72-hour period, October 3rd to 5th, 2025, it really is a snapshot of the whole challenge, isn't it? Let's try and synthesize the key things for you, the listener, to take away from this. So, in just those 3 days, you saw Hamas make this really complex offer, all hostages back, but only for a permanent ceasefire. And they added that political piece, agreeing to a technocratic body for Gaza, referencing a U.S. plan. That prompted President Trump to jump in, urging a pause, but framed very specifically around just getting the hostages out safely. But then, bam, the Israeli rejection. Why? Because the offer didn't include those key security guarantees, disarmament and control. That was the deal breaker. And all this against the backdrop of continued devastating airstrikes on the ground, killing dozens more people, which then led straight into setting up the next round of mediated indirect talks starting October 5th.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to watch now, moving forward from that point, is how this negotiation fundamentally shifted. It's not just about hostages anymore, though that's obviously critical. It's become explicitly about the future administration of Gaza. Hamas put a political model, that technocratic body, on the table. Israel countered with its non-negotiable security demands, disarmament, control. So the big question really becomes, as these indirect talks get underway, with Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S. trying to bridge the gap, which priority ultimately carries the day? Is it the humanitarian release focus, pushed by the U.S. and others? Or is it the military control and disarmament priority insisted upon by Israel? Which one will shape the immediate outcome, the success or failure, of this next diplomatic phase? That's what you need to watch.
It really shows that the details matter so much more than just the headlines of offer made or offer rejected.
Yeah.
You have to look at the specific terms, the conditions, the omissions. That's where the real story is unfolding. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the specifics of that critical moment. We'll be back soon with more context and analysis to help you stay informed.